Thank you all for being here. Assalamu alaikum. Yes, I would like to talk to you today about Persian and Pashto literature, specifically from the 18th century, and hopefully by the end of the discussion, I've kind of disturbed or rejected some of that categorization of Persian and Pashto literature as kind of types. I think there's a phenomenon that's been noted recently by a number of scholars that's been going for many decades, that Pashto literature in particular is often viewed through an ethnic or national lens. This is on the one hand by Pashtun scholars who take a nationalist perspective and understand Pashto literature as quintessentially Pashtun and Pashtun literature as necessarily in Pashto. On the other hand, it comes from the fact that Pashto literature tends not to be canonized in what we might call world literature in the way that perhaps Persian literature has been offered the opportunity to become. So it tends to be seen almost as something kind of ethnographic and ethnically particularist as opposed to something with a potential for universality. Before I kind of try to reject some of those ideas or qualify them historically, I'll first give a bit of ground, because I think that perspective is quite modern, but there are historical bases for it. And I'll start just by offering, little button's not working now. Back for a moment. There we go. I'll start by just giving a sample of some poetry from the mid-18th century by the poet Khushhal Khan Khattak, who traveled a lot in northern India. And he said, Ahle Hind zama pa jaba na pohigi, warsara ahle Iran wa Turani. The people of India don't understand my language, and neither do the people of Iran or the Turanis. And that's just a little illustrative idea that, you know, Pashto is something for a particular people. Other people don't understand it. Some of the earliest Pashto literature that we have from the 16th century was written by non-Pashtuns, such as the Akhund Darveza, who lived in the Yusufzai regions, was not himself a Pashtun, but wrote in Pashto literature, as he explains in this copy of his Makhzanul Islam. In Persian, he explains it, notably, that he wrote it in the Afghani, i.e. Pashto language, so that the Afghans might derive full benefit. The idea, again, that the reason to write in Pashto is to appeal to or to be understood by the Pashto speakers and not anybody else. Otherwise, maybe write in Persian. So there is something historical there. But I think it's ultimately a limiting way of looking at this literature and how the cultures interact. And this manuscript from which this photo was taken is one that I consulted at an archive in Shrewsbury in Shropshire in England. And it's from the late 19th century, and just wedged in between the leaves of this manuscript were a number of little notes of people who probably owned it in a village in what is now the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was looted by the British Army, by the way. And all those notes are in a variety of languages and deal with various things through different languages. There are notes about wanting to get money back on loans that are written in Persian. There is some Pashto poetry, and at the bottom of the Pashto poetry, there's a little prescription written in Persian again for, you know, what to cook at various times, probably to help with some health issue. There's Arabic written for religious purposes on a scrap of paper. So multilingualism really is the norm. Multilingualism is the social kind of baseline. And we know that for a lot of history and for the present in a lot of communities where Pashto is spoken. So how can we maybe think differently about this idea of Pashto as this thing that is always geared towards some kind of ethnic expression of being Pashtun? And I think a way to do that is to look into the historical record and to think about literature. Now, what I really wanted to do when I submitted the abstract for this presentation was to focus on two 18th century writers from what would now be Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan, one called Muizullah Mohmand, who was from the Peshawar Valley, and this is the frontispiece, a little beat up of a manuscript of a book that he composed in the mid-18th century, which is a kind of administrative manual and it's written entirely in Persian. It includes a kind of bibliography of all these Arabic and Persian sources that he used going back to the 13th century and then up to quite contemporary sources for his time. And in the end of it, he also expressed a kind of view of what he felt Afghan experience, Afghan in that context, it's complicated, but more or less aligning with the idea of Pashtun in the way that he uses it. He outlines what he considered was Afghan history in Hindustan up until that point, how they had suffered under the Mughals, how Ahmad Shah Durrani, under whose reign he was writing, was going to have changed all of this and introduced an era of new prosperity for the Afghan Jamaat, as he called it. But he wrote all of this in Persian. So there's that element of expressing identity, but not necessarily in the language that you speak natively. And there's this thing of engaging in genre outside of the Pashto language. I also wanted to talk a lot about this other author from Tirah in the Khyber called Ali Akbar Orakzai, and these are some illustrations that he probably made in a compendium of his writing called Gulshan-e Afghan, which is a compendium of writing in Persian and Pashto, and he talks about his literary education, and he talks about the fact that he includes a lot of poems that he wrote as a young man, which he considers not very good poems, ones that he's a bit embarrassed by, but he wanted to include them so that people would take an interest and would also learn Pashto. He wanted people to be able to learn it through his literature. So this is not this kind of particularist ethnic thing that is being guarded among one community. There's this idea that he could engage with universal ideas while still having a sense of his own identity. He writes about Pakhtunkhwa, his homeland. But yeah, there was not this particularism in the way that he approached things. Anyway, as I kept researching, I found something else that I'd like to focus on a little bit more closely than even these two cases, just because I think they're very vivid and very, very illustrative, also from roughly the mid-18th century. And that's a couple of poems by a poet known only to us as Habibullah. His divan is hopefully still held at the National Museum in Delhi, but it was published in edited format in Afghanistan in 1981. And Habibullah most likely was from and certainly lived in the Peshawar Valley in the Khalil area, which is also where I'm from on my father's side. He wrote primarily in Pashto. He also wrote poems in Persian, and he wrote a number of poems that are mixed language, one that is mixed Pashto and Persian, and several that are mixed Pashto, Persian, and Urdu. And I think these poems give us an interesting way to think about these writers, not as Pashto authors who maybe dabbled in other languages, but were primarily defined by this Pashto and also, therefore, Pashtunness, but as authors, as members of a literary culture who used these languages in different ways to communicate different ideas, who could use Pashto for universal ideas or particular ones, and could use Persian for likewise the same range of things. And I think just the very structure and almost physical aspect of moving between those languages and when you read these poems helps to disrupt that idea of a particularism in literature, especially an ethnic particularism. So this is one poem. We don't need to worry about the whole translation. That's why I've not provided it. I just want to almost emphasize, again, that almost physical or visual aspect of looking at where the language changes. The blue is the Pashto, and the bold black is the Persian. And I've just tentatively entitled it Where, because the repeated rhyme is kujast, kujast, kujast in Persian. But you can see also all these poems are serious genre poems of particular love poetry that is very common and understood, mystically inflected love poetry from this region. You know, it's not frivolous, it is entertaining in a way. I like the movement between these languages, and it's often, especially once we get to some of the Urdu ones, I find it rhythmically very satisfying, and there's some playfulness to it perhaps, but this is serious stuff. This is the kind of poetry that, you know, was the bread and butter of a lot of literary production at this time, and his moving between these languages is something that he does, you know, with skill, with confidence, and also in a way that indicates perhaps that this is poetry that is sort of for everybody. You know, poetry will always be particular in the sense that it will be bound by a language or languages and a culture, but by playing with those boundaries just in one composition, you start to challenge that a little bit. and Pashto is brought into this bigger fold, or perhaps it was just always there. The next poem, we see Persian and Urdu put together. And he just uses the Urdu for just this phrase in red at the end to provide the rhyme, and it's just this Urdu phrase which I've given my tentative title out of that. What a calamity, kya bala hai. And I find this one satisfying at the way it ends in every kya bala hai, kya bala hai, kya. I like that, and it's fun. But again, this is a serious genre kind of poetic production that it moves between these languages. And here, there's not even the Pashto to be found. He's able to move between all these three in ways that, took him at the time and that people would have understood when reading this, would have been able, and people still would now, perhaps less with the Persian for various historical reasons. But again, multilingualism, like in the Peshawar Valley, for instance, that is the norm. Hindko, Pashto, Urdu, English, all these things are active, and people, Pashtuns and others, write literature in all these languages. So why is it that Pashto needs to be only bound up with a sense of one ethnic identity? So then the last one is kind of the culmination for me, is the combination in all three of these languages. Here he uses these Urdu verbs at the end to provide the rhymes. In one instance, he uses a bit longer phrase, Yar mera na aaye. The rest, he uses the Farsi, he uses the Pashto in this kind of back and forth. Again, just disrupting those boundaries, moving between the languages, again, confidently, in a way that is also literarily satisfying, and that I think, again, encourages that reflection on, is this a Pashto author, or is this an author of a type of his culture and his time period who is able to mobilize these languages for literary effect, for fun, perhaps, in a way, but to do something serious in a literary sphere. And just as like a point of comparison, if we have an Afghan or Iranian scholar that writes in English, we see that as a contribution to a field, not as a sort of sideshow because of language choice. When Nashanas sings in Dari, he's singing Afghan music just as much as when he's singing in Pashto. He's not a Pashto singer or a Dari singer in this kind of narrow way. So I think we can think about that in terms of the historical literature and literature in general. This coexistence and interplay of languages is the point of continuity historically, and this idea of wanting to nationalize, whether ethnically or as part of a kind of civilizational idea or model, is often very limiting to that reality, and it can't really square that easily. But the roots of this kind of cultural and linguistic environment are very much alive, as I mentioned, in the case of Peshawar Valley, in the case of Afghanistan, we've heard in different presentations. So then that kind of leaves us with the question of, and I will do a little linguistic playing myself, what is our future like? And I'll put the hour in Pashto zamung, and I'll put the future in Farsi, I'll say ayanda, and then in the last verb, like Habibullah, I'll put in Urdu and say kaisa hai. What's gonna happen? Well, obviously I don't know. That's the easy and flippant answer. I don't know what the future is like for us. But to also tie back a little bit to Nancy Lindisfarne's presentation, I think to build on any of this historical potential to do with cultural communicability and shared literature and cultural practices, to really build on that, it's never going to be enough for me to sit up here and talk about literature from the 18th century. This is, a very small part of all that. All these things are bound up in really large structural and historical and economic difficulties and problems and processes that need to be addressed, and the people who really go way further in anything I could do in addressing that are the people on the ground who build solidarity in communities, and I think often class-based solidarity goes a long way here, and I think that idea that Dr. Lindisfarne put forward of looking at it in terms of the haves and have-nots in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, this is very important. You see movements in Pakistan like the PTM, who, they have a sort of, you could call it a nationalist or an ethnic focus because of their historical and current conditions, but they build solidarity across groups. They are interested in, reaching out in seeking redress and justice from these domineering states, local and international elites that are bound up in a kind of economy and a political culture that is in their interests and leaves a lot of people behind. And that kind of work on the ground is necessary for us to then talk about translating into cultural after effects like accepting this, shared literary background and talking about the 18th century and what have you. That is where all the change is really going to come from. And the people there are doing it. We had some mention earlier in response to a question about that area of Fatah and the former, what used to be the federally administered tribal areas. And the biggest and most sort of clear-eyed progressive political thing happening in the northwest of Pakistan is coming out of that area, which is seen as a backwater, historically, currently, but in terms of their ideas and how they engage across languages with English language ideas and Western concepts talking about, in English, referring to colonialism and the need for redress, and neo-colonialism talking about discourses of human rights that are both kind of within their communities but also able to communicate outside of that. That is where all that potential really lies. So I could give 100 of these presentations and end up changing nothing, but once those material things begin to change, then perhaps we can build on some of the potential that these generations following this time, they failed to build on in a way, because the elitism and the kind of person that Habibullah probably was, a landowner from the Khalil in the Peshawar Valley, his ancestors probably, like some of my own family members, allied with the British and helped build up a lot of these oppressive structures that continue to this day as an extension of what they used to be prior to the colonial period. So to build on that potential from this time that has kind of taken so many blows, and to build on the real potential that exists on the ground because this kind of multicultural and multilingual reality is there, we're going to have to look to and follow, as frankly elites and wealthy people often living in the West anyway, to follow that lead. And that to me is ultimately the most important thing. Thank you.